Welcome back, everyone. It's Mr. Russell, and as promised, I told you I'd be back in a few days with some information on your summer reading, A History of the World in Six Classes by Standage. Today we're going to talk about part one, which is beer, wine, and spirits. And in talking about part one, it's really going to give you a good idea of what our first semester will look like. One thing I want to say about the book itself. We're talking in this first part about beer, wine, and spirits. This is in no way meant to endorse the drinking of these, especially at your age, since it's illegal. This is simply meant by Standage to highlight how something as small as drink has played such a pivotal role in the forming of human history. So let's talk a little about periodization. When discussing periodization, we can split it apart based on the book in the first three periods. We're starting with beer. And beer is our first chapter. And when discussing beer, as you've probably already noticed by reading chapter one, beer is really all about the agricultural or Neolithic revolution. It's about the formation of human societies and civilizations and all of those initial early civilizations along the Fertile Crescent. Then we move to wine, and wine is kind of what we think of as the classical period. The classical period goes from around 600 BCE to a little past zero. Some people take it as far up as 600 BC or 600 CE, or the Common Era, and then that brings us to spirits. And spirits is what we think of as the post-classical era. And in periodization, the post-classical era goes up to about 1450 AD or CE. We're going to use for the purpose of our class CE, which stands for Common Era, and BCE, which stands for Before Common Era. Now, these three chapters, beer, wine, and spirits, really in essence take into account everything that we'll cover in the first semester. You can see just by looking at the slide that this goes from about 8,000 to about 600. This goes from 600 to 600, and again, that's the most common periodization for the classical period. And then this goes from 600 to 1450. 600 and 1450 is really the post-classical period. When we get to coffee, tea, and Coca-Cola, this is going to be our second semester of study, which goes from 1450 all the way up to present day. So you can kind of see how the book is split apart, which is why it's always a good idea to read this book before you start a world history course, because it gives you a good idea of what we're studying. So now let's take a closer look at the first part. Standage starts with part one, that's beer, and it makes an appearance on the world stage starting in ancient Mesopotamia, which is modern day Iraq, Syria, Middle East. That's what we know today, and also includes Egypt. So you can see by looking at this map that civilization begins in what we call the Fertile Crescent. And why does civilization begin here? Just common sense will tell you, either based on history, archaeology, anthropology, that we begin to see geography as everything. And that's the one thing that we'll really start looking at in the very first unit of our study. This area is known as the Fertile Crescent because humanity is able to begin farming, domestication of animals. It begins to live in cities. It starts to set up civilizations because being around waterways at this time, they're able to grow food. It's no longer about hunting and gathering. Now it's about setting up cities and civilizations. So as you'll see when we start the school year, this isn't necessarily the case in many other parts of the world, but it is the case here. And this is why beer becomes so important. So what Standage begins talking about is the emergence of beer. Water is and always will be the most vital fluid on the planet. But up until Mesopotamia, it was really the only drink. Once you start to see the growth of crops, especially of wheat and barley, in the Fertile Crescent, life in Mesopotamia, this switch from hunting to gathering in the Paleolithic area was systematic in kind of forming the creation of what we know as beer. So an amazing thing started to happen when humans settled. They began to eat the grains and wheat and barley, and they began to set up storage for them as well. The storage became key in the creation of beer. It was not just an invention. A lot of times we think of it as an invention, but it wasn't an invention, it was more of a discovery. What happened with beer is it ended up being fermented. And this is what most anthropologists, scientists, historians believe. It was set in a container with the wheat and barley. It was left out in the rain, and when early humans came across the liquid and drank it, they discovered it had a taste to it. So what it really amounts to is liquid bread, but when it's left to ferment, the sugars begin to break down and it forms alcohol. Now, beer itself was first used as kind of a social drink. Later on, it started to be used as what we think of today as edible money. And then liquor in general, especially starting with beer, begins to be used as a religious offering. The urban revolution that Standage refers to in the second chapter is the result of what we call the agricultural revolution. By creating a revolution in agriculture where you're actually able to build a civilization around waterways and you don't constantly have to move as a nomadic tribe in order to find food, you begin to start up urban areas. And in these urban areas, you start to see a lot of specialized labor positions and you start to see a lot of socialization within each of these communities. So beer was a staple at this time. It was consumed by everyone, the rich, the poor, men, women, adults, and children. It didn't matter where you sat on the social pyramid, it was the common man's drink. It the same kind of beer that we have today. It wasn't really the same kind. It was a lot less alcohol, but there was obviously still some alcohol in it in the ancient drink. It was also used as a form of payment. So the individuals that built the pyramids were actually paid in beer and bread, which I have a quote from Standage here. They were generally paid 3 to 4 loaves of bread and 2 jugs containing about 4 liters of beer. Um, you can see that the beer itself at that time had about 3% alcohol by volume. Today, most of the time you get beer, it has about 5% alcohol by volume. So it's a little bit more than what the ancient Egyptians had. Another interesting thing that I definitely want to point out about the concept of beer. Beer, just as it is today, in fact, many of these drinks that you're reading about in Standage's book, they kind of follow along with the same concept. It's used as a social drink, and in ancient Egypt, it was oftentimes drank from shared vessels, where individuals would sit around in a community gathering. Long reeds were dropped in, and they were used as straws, and everyone drank from the same container. At this time, it really helped build community. And you see that a lot of these drinks do something very similar today. The concept that we have today of bars, of happy hour, of coffee shops, um, tea gatherings or tea parties. Any and every one of these, it kind of has the same unique function that it's had throughout human history, where it brings and begins building community and society rather than tearing it apart. Unfortunately, some of these drinks have also been known to tear communities apart. We'll get to that a little bit later. Another interesting thing about beer is the medicinal purpose that it was used for. The beer that was provided to the ancient Egyptians, the beer that was created in Mesopotamia, it has vitamin B. And when you combine vitamin B with dates and onions, which were staples of the Egyptians' diet at that time, it provides a whole range of vitamins for these early civilizations. We know a lot of this because around this time when we're starting to see the development of writing, it was used to keep track of farming, building, workers, and compensation. So in other words, you see a lot of the writing that has information about bread and beer. The symbol for beer, which you can see right at the top here, this piece right here, can be seen through a lot of the cuneiform documents that we have on the stone tablets that we have with writing at this time. But it was also being used with that vitamin B and with the combined diet of dates and onions to treat people that had illnesses or who were sick. Alcohol obviously couldn't cure them, but it was often used as a sedative. It's a depressant. So the effects that it had on somebody who was sick, it oftentimes gave them um, some sense of sedation. The placebo effect oftentimes made them believe they were being cured, And we all know the placebo effect is very real just through looking at it in psychology. So oftentimes it would be used as medicinal purpose as well, for the medicinal purpose. Boiled beer also is much less likely to be contaminated. We know that water at this time, and we see this worldwide still today, oftentimes water has diseases, any number of diseases that could kill human beings, especially when they spread in a civilization's water supply, and that's what they rely upon. But when you boil the beer, it's much less likely to be contaminated, and the mass production of beer was done through boiling, and that helps keep drinking supplies and contaminants away and helps keep disease at bay as well. The cuneiform tablets that you see here as well, we'll be talking a lot more about, especially in the first week or two of our course. So we'll get to those. This then brings us on to kind of the global process of increasing agriculture, urban settlements, the trade patterns, the evolution of writing, health, and nutrition. It sets up the context for what life would become like in these ancient civilizations that help us lead up to the classical period. So my big question to you to kind of think about, and one that we'll discuss when we get back together at the end of August, was beer important to the beginning of civilization, and could humanity have survived as well without it? It's an interesting question to kind of think about because we often don't think about some of these small staples like onions and dates and beer and what it actually had to bring together societies, civilizations, how it helps with urban settlement, how it helps with trade patterns. We have yet to come to some of the major trade patterns, but we will soon. So a big question is, how much of an impact did it have on civilization? And could we be where we are today without beer? This then takes us to chapter 2 of Standage's book, and that's Wine in Ancient Greece and the Roman Empire. This is where a lot of what we consider Western civilization and Westernized philosophy has its roots. Ideas like democracy, representative government, a senate, a strong military, philosophy, entertainment, spectacle, they all derive from this time period. And this individualistic way of the Western world develops here. You have individuals like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Caesar, Spartacus, Jesus. And in this time period, it's known as the classical era. It's one that throughout the ages people romanticize. They remember back fondly. They try and recreate. This is what the entire Renaissance period that we'll study, especially in England and Italy, it's all about. It's all about coming back to the classical age of ancient Greece and Rome. So this is where Standage kind of moves and uses wine in order to move forward to this period. The Greeks considered wine to be some kind of truth serum of sorts. It brings man's true character out, and the Greeks used it in social circles, almost like a game or entertainment. Now, it's not to say that wine did not exist prior to the classical era. In fact, a lot of historians believe wine may be just as old or older than beer. We can't be for certain because there's not writing in the cuneiform tablets about wine. All we see is beer. However, to make wine, you have to have fresh grapes, and the storage of wine becomes the issue. A great example of this comes from 870 BCE in the Assyrian king Ashurasirpal II. And he throws a massive party and introduces his people to this new drink known as wine. Part of it is feasting, part of it's a celebration. They feast for 10 straight days. A big part of it, of course, as you see with many Assyrian kings, is to show off wealth. But the problem with wine, even though it becomes extremely popular, is that it's very expensive. It's 10 times the cost of beer to create. Now, it's not producing wine. Producing wine is much easier than beer. It's the storing of the wine because it's much more difficult in comparison. Oftentimes, if you ferment grapes, it can quickly turn to vinegar instead of wine, meaning it loses its taste, it loses all of its properties. So the storage of wine becomes essential to the transformation. It takes a lot of planning, knowledge, and the proper facilities, and of course the right geographic area. So we know just by recounting this story that wine was around long before the classical era. We see record of it as far back as 870, which is prior to what we normally think of as the start of the classical era in periodization. Remember, classical era generally goes from 600 BCE to 600 CE. But this is just one example of where we see it in history prior to the classical era. So in ancient Greece, wine also helped draw the line between what was thought of as civilized and what was thought of as barbarian. A lot of this comes from Thucydides, a Greek historian, one of the most famous Greek historians. And he stated that learning to cultivate the olive and the vine becomes the difference between barbarism and civilized behavior. The masses drank beer. To drink beer was barbaric. Wine was the drink of the privileged. So in many ways, it kind of created this class distinction in ancient Greece. In fact, we still see that today in many ways. The symposium becomes this ritualistic male event where entertainment and networking begins to materialize for the well-to-do. Oftentimes, it's at a symposium, wine would be drank. Their very popular Greek literature called the Symposium, that is really about all of these philosophers sitting around drinking wine and recounting stories about love and about lust and about life and trying to philosophize about life in general. But like beer, wine for its alcoholic properties make decent medicine in some ways. Again, being kind of a sedative, changing the way somebody feels. So viticulture becomes massively important. And viticulture, as you'll see, is the growing of grapes instead of grain. And it becomes extremely important in terms of trade at this time. So the fields of present-day Italy, for example, they're focused on producing wine more so than grains. So getting back to the symposium a little bit, let's take a look at this quote, "Wine reveals what is hidden." This quote really is the methodology behind the symposium. Truth can be brought out of men with just a bit of alcohol. At this time, the idea of philosophy was really revolutionary. As advanced as the Greeks really were, they were also an ancient world with a very spiritual mindset. The Greeks had no word to denote religion or spiritual nature. It was simply life. It was all around them. The polytheistic gods that sat upon Mount Olympus, they were woven into Greek culture, but in Athens, another fabric had been created, and that was the idea of democracy. The principles of democracy, again, this community building, sharing a bowl of wine, sharing of ideas, the best arguments and solutions win. However, in ancient Greece, one thing that's important to remember is that only men could be citizens, and only men could drink and discuss in the symposium. The picture down at the bottom is the Academy, and we'll talk a little bit about the Academy in just a moment. In fact, let's get to that picture. So this is the School of Athens. It was painted by Raphael in 1509 during the Renaissance. And the Academy was founded by Plato in 387. Aristotle was one of his students. The Academy persists throughout most of the Hellenistic period. It's a skeptical school. It teaches the Socratic method, which is something coming back into education even today. A lot of philosophers continue to teach Plato's philosophy well into the Roman era. It's not until about 410 AD or CE that the revived academy was reestablished, and it lasts until 529, even after the Roman Empire falls. It's closed down finally by Justinian I. So this idea of education about questioning the Socratic method, that's the way to learning. It existed well beyond Greek society and well after the Hellenistic period. So by the 2nd century BCE, the Romans, who were originally from central Italy, displaced the Greeks, and they become one of the main powers of the Mediterranean. However, an important thing to note, and many of you have looked at Greek mythology, you've studied Greek mythology, you know Roman mythology just by knowing Greek myth, they take a lot of those aspects of Greek culture, like the gods, the myths, they modify the Greek alphabet, they imitated Greek architecture. The Constitution is modeled off Greek lines. Education, they begin to study Greek literature and the language. So wine embodies at this time where Rome had come from and where they were going and what they wanted to become. So they begin cultivating the vine. They're a people of hard work. They're proud. The results become the production of wine, which becomes a symbol of cultural sophistication. Um, there's a massive demand at this time for wine. Now, slavery was a part of both cultures. However, the slaves of the Roman Empire were used to a fault. Instead of focusing on coming up with more efficient ways of doing business, the Romans would oftentimes just throw more slaves and manpower at a problem. This is one of the ways their civilization begins to fall and goes into decline, but they still end up building one of the greatest empires in the world that the world has ever seen. So, how did the use of wine in Rome differ from that of ancient Greece? Well, again, the Romans and Greeks are often thought of as the same by students because they share so many of the same characteristics. But a better way to think of it is that the Romans conquered the Greeks militarily, yet the Romans were overcome by everything Greek as a result. So the gods, education, architecture, and wine was no exception. So again, the big use of it, possibly more slaves, more manpower in order to cultivate the vines, and possibly in order to bring more of a community together, especially in terms of the military. Those are two of the biggest differences. But there really is not much of a difference because so much of ancient Rome consists of Greek antiquity. So the final point I want to make in looking at chapter 2 regarding Standage's wine chapters, it focuses on non-Western ways of life. Islam and Christianity are two of the biggest religions today, yet they look at alcohol in very different manners. Why is this? Well, part of the issue is the fact that Muslims view alcohol as a Western way, a Catholic Church tradition. And remember, the Catholic Church is the original church of Christianity. So deciding to go against this in Islam was reactionary. However, Muhammad made a great point when he said in the Quran, wine and games of chance should be avoided so that you can prosper. It definitely does make some sense. Culturally, wine was a vital part of the Mediterranean Christian life. Islam then decided to prohibit alcoholic consumption. The two religions have not changed much in regard to this day. So a lot of it is just kind of a reaction against the Christian church, the Catholic Church especially. Again, one of the big points to remember is that it's still very similar to this day. So this then takes us to our last part, and I'll try and get through this relatively quickly. I know we're running fairly long, but this is the Age of Spirits. The Age of Exploration, also the post-classical period, leads to another experiment with alcohol, and it produces a world-changing drink. Drink number 3, chapter number 3, is spirits, and it impacts global transportation. It helps Britain attain world power status with the energy of vitamin C, and it increases the demand for slavery. Sadly, the last point that I want to make really becomes one of the biggest points in looking at spirits from this time period. So just why are they called spirits? There are 3 different theories to why we call them spirits. And the first theory is about the word alcohol itself. Our common word and use of alcohol actually comes from the Arabic word al cool. Sorry, that should be a K. Al cool. And al cool in Arabic means body eating spirit. This is where some theorists claim the idea or concept of the English translation spirits actually comes from. Another theory is the distillation process. When you distill alcohol, it turns clear. So if it's a brownish liquid based on what you're distilling, it turns clear, and some of the medieval distillers believed that they were removing a spirit from the alcohol. That's why you even have some in Europe to this day, after they've distilled a bottle of alcohol, they'll put the first shot on the ground for good luck, kind of for the angels, I suppose. And then theory number 3, it puts one in good spirits. And that's probably the easiest and most likely. It makes the most sense. But a lot of it could have to do with the actual word and the fact that it comes from alcohol is derived from the Arabic word of alcohol. So the process of distilling alcohol to create spirits, and when we're talking about spirits, we're talking about things like vodka, gin, rum, it makes a stronger alcoholic drink. And you can even go through the process, looping through the process many times, and it creates a stronger and stronger drink each time you do it. The actual process of distillation originates in Cordoba by the Arabs, and they're doing it to allow the miracle medicine of distilled wine to travel a bit better so that they're able to travel and trade it. Distilling wine makes it a lot stronger because the boiling point of alcohol is lower than that of water. So as the wine is heated, vapor begins to rise from its surface and it starts to boil. Now, due to alcohol's low boiling point, the vapor continues proportionately more alcohol and less water than the original liquid. So this knowledge that the Arabs actually passed down is very similar to the distillation process. It's called cultural diffusion. And the knowledge that's picked up by the Europeans at this time, kind of coming out of the Dark Ages from this area of non-learning to learning, they're beginning to pick up this process and trying it with all different types of alcohol. So in Europe, when we move from the Dark Ages into this kind of Enlightenment age, or this, not quite the Enlightenment age, I don't want to use that term, but into this age of new knowledge, we're moving toward the Renaissance. And knowledge of new technology, especially of this distillation, spreads quickly. And a lot of historians look back and say that it begins to spread so quickly because there are so many advances in mathematics, there are advances in the printing press, for example. Now, the printing press isn't new. It's first found in China, but it's Gutenberg who gives Europeans the ability to spread knowledge quickly and brings the printing press to Europe. And so knowledge of distilling spirits spreads quickly throughout the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. And this is in part what kind of leads to the strength of Europe at the time. And what Standage is attempting to do with the concept of spirits is by taking something like a drink, something so minor and something so small, you can look at how it spreads just like cultural diffusion, and it spreads and creates kind of this empire that they begin to use for their own benefit. So how do they use it for their own benefit? Well, hard liquor like brandy and rum begins to placate sailors during long sea voyages, and it's interesting because it actually helps them survive, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But again, it's an impact that begins to really benefit the British. There's a drink called grog, and grog becomes the drink for sailors in the 18th century. It's a mixture that includes lemon and lime juice to kind of take away some of the flavor, make it a little bit less harsh, and it includes water as well. So they would make grog with rum, water, and lemon or lime juice. This improves the taste, but it also begins to reduce illness and scurvy. Now, a reason for that is that it was finally discovered that scurvy, that based on the daily doses they had of vitamin C, which they're getting from the lemons or limes that are used, they're building up their immune system, meaning that it supplements the diet with citrus fruits, and it allows them to avoid getting scurvy, which is something that had impacted sailors long before. So if you look at this kind of from a slippery slope angle, you can see that by sailors surviving and being able to make long sea voyages and make those sea voyages even longer, they're able to then spread their wings. They're able to explore a lot more, which in turn moves to the age of exploration that we see. A lot of this is done based on the use of something like spirits. Now, it's called grog, and it's actually named after Admiral Edward Vernon, who was called Old Grog because he used to wear, as you can see in the photo beside, this old grogram coat. And it was a habit for him that he would always put this on. Just an interesting connection to the United States. For those of you that took U.S. history last year, Admiral Edward Vernon is the namesake for Mount Vernon, the estate of George Washington. It's named after the admiral. Washington's half-brother Lawrence Washington served under Vernon and named the estate after his former commander. So that's just kind of a link to some U.S. history for you. So with the connection to American history, let's talk a little bit about the colonies and how they limited alcoholic beverage choices. They actually brought distilling over to New England, and the trade wars resulted in the Molasses Act, the Sugar Act, the boycotts of imports, fight over taxes. The distilling of molasses for rum begins to power the New England economy, and rum was an extremely important product of trade between Britain, Africa, and North American colonies. And Standage suggests, and again, I don't know what other historians believe, it might be an interesting question to ask Donnelly, but Standage suggests that rum may have been more responsible than tea for the independence movement of the American colonies. The British tried to tax molasses, for example, no taxation without representation, which is a phrase that originates with molasses and sugar. It's only near the end of the protest that colonists refer to tea. So a lot of historians, world historians, look back and say that rum may have been more responsible for independence than tea. One of the last things to talk about in this chapter is the unfortunate concept of slavery. It's the really dark side of all of the drinks and all of this period, and that's the acceleration of oppression during this time. We'll be focusing a lot during the post-colonial period on colonization. Like the Romans before, the Europeans forced others to work to benefit them economically. And the absolute worst place a slave could be at this time was in the Caribbean, where sugar plantations were going on. It was a living hell on earth for most of them. Rum was the drink that fueled this oppression. So again, although it aided in human exploration, it also is one of the downsides because it begins to fuel oppression of slaves. The demand for it was high, and ironically, to produce sugarcane, Europeans traded rum for slaves. The rum was made by the slaves themselves by producing the main ingredient, sugar. So although spirits were involved with the spread of knowledge, exploration of the planet, the use of new Arab technology, the dark side was extreme. Not only do you have slavery, but you also have the spread of infectious and deadly diseases, brutal slave conditions, economic oppression through strong armed trading tactics, revolution, the subjugation of indigenous people, and this time period sees the greatest human catastrophe in the history of the planet. Some estimates indicate that the fatality rates were 80 to 90% of the Native American populations. They died out based on the smallpox epidemics alone. The resulting piece that we have in world history is known as the Columbian Exchange. This changed the planet in ways that are hard to even imagine today, and we'll be spending a lot of time talking about the Columbian Exchange. Just things that were traded from the Americas, both South America, Central America, and the new colonies, and things that were coming in from Europe. And you'll notice probably a couple of the most devastating, for example, are the diseases right here, where you have smallpox, influenza, typhus, measles, malaria, diphtheria, whooping cough. Some of those that Europeans and even Africans were able to survive because they were involved with trade long before the Americas were even settled. But unfortunately, with the trade of these diseases and even with livestock that the Americas had not been exposed to, they got diseases just from all of the trade during the Columbian Exchange. So if we're trying to put kind of an idea on how it impacts us today, think about some of the most popular foods we have today. One example is culinary here. We have Italian spaghetti. Tomatoes are from the New World, not Italy. Then you have the all-American hot dog, made of specially selected meat trimmings of beef and pork. All of those originally are from Europe. Then you have the Mexican fajita. Beef is from Europe. The flour tortilla is from Europe. Rice is also from Europe. So when we think about the foods that we generally associate with major cultures, even to this day, you can see that the Columbian Exchange has a huge impact on all of those different types of foods. So we'll talk a lot more about Columbian Exchange, especially the second part of the school year after winter break. But that's it right now for now. I'll try and update probably sometime within the next week with some more information on the last three chapters, coffee, tea, and Coca-Cola. Until then, please email if you have questions. I hope you were able to make it through this very long presentation. I appreciate your patience, and I will talk to you all and see you soon.